You've probably felt a small, automatic recoil at the idea of a brother marrying a sister. You didn't choose that feeling. You didn't learn it from a textbook. It just arrived, fully formed, somewhere in your childhood, and it never left. But for 3,000 years, in some of the most powerful families on Earth, that recoil simply wasn't there. Kings married their sisters. Queens married their brothers. And their courts, their priests, their entire societies watched and said nothing. What if the thing you feel isn't a moral law at all? What if it's a switch, and some people's switches never got flipped?
Start in Egypt. Not with peasants, not with soldiers, but with the royal family itself. Pharaohs married their full sisters, generation after generation, from at least the 12th dynasty onward, and the practice reached its peak under the Ptolemies, the Greek-descended rulers who took the Egyptian throne after Alexander the Great. Cleopatra, the Cleopatra, was married to two of her own younger brothers in succession. Not stepbrothers, not half-siblings by some distant cousin's remarriage, full brothers, sharing both parents, sharing a nursery, sharing a bloodline that was supposed to stay unbroken.
Why would anyone do this? The answer the Egyptians themselves gave was theological. Their gods did it first. Osiris married his sister Isis. Geb married his sister Nut. If the divine order of the universe ran on sibling marriage, then a pharaoh, who was considered a living god, was simply following the only pattern that made sense to him. He wasn't marrying a stranger. He was marrying the one person on earth whose blood was as sacred as his own. Anyone else would have diluted it. Anyone else would have made him ordinary.
But there's a second answer, a colder one, and it has nothing to do with gods. Power doesn't like to share. A pharaoh who married outside the family created a new set of in-laws, a new noble house with a claim on the throne, a rival bloodline waiting for its moment. A pharaoh who married his sister created no new claimants at all. The throne stayed sealed inside one family, one lineage, one small circle of people who could never be replaced by an ambitious father-in-law. It was a fortress built out of marriage instead of stone. And the price of that fortress was written directly into the bodies of the people who lived inside it. In 2010, a team led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass published a genetic study in the Journal of the American Medical Association examining the mummy of Tutankhamun and his immediate family. The results were stark. Tutankhamun's parents were very likely siblings themselves, and the young pharaoh's body showed a cluster of conditions consistent with inbreeding: a clubfoot, bone necrosis, a weakened immune system that may have made him vulnerable to the malaria the study also detected in his remains. He died around the age of 19. His fortress of pure blood had quietly poisoned him from the inside. Here's what makes Egypt stranger than most people realize. This wasn't only a habit of gods and pharaohs sealed away at the very top of society. Centuries later, under Roman rule, census records collected from the Egyptian province show something historians still argue about today. The historian Keith Hopkins, examining tax and census documents from Roman Egypt, found evidence that ordinary citizens, not royalty, not priests, but shopkeepers and farmers, were marrying their full siblings at rates high enough to appear repeatedly across the surviving paperwork. For a brief stretch of history, in one province of one empire, the taboo that grips almost every other human society seems to have loosened for people with no throne to protect at all. Which tells you something unsettling. The instinct you feel isn't hardwired the same way gravity is. It bends under the right cultural pressure in the right place at the right time.
Now, leave Egypt behind, because this wasn't a one-time accident of one river valley. Cross the Atlantic centuries later to the Inca Empire, high in the Andes. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was expected to take his full sister as his principal wife, the Koya,
Their children carried the purest possible claim to divine descent, because the Inca believed their ruling family descended directly from the sun god Inti. A commoner's blood mixed into that line would have been an insult to the sun itself. So brother married sister, again and again, dynasty after dynasty, right up until the Spanish conquest tore the whole system down in the 16th century. Spanish chroniclers, writing after the conquest, described the practice with a mixture of horror and fascination, unable to reconcile the wealth and order of the empire they just destroyed with a custom their own religion treated as monstrous. Sail further to the Hawaiian Islands, and you find the same architecture, built from completely different materials. Hawaiian high chiefs practiced what was called niaupio, a marriage between full siblings meant to concentrate the highest possible mana, the spiritual power and authority that legitimized a ruler. A child born of that union was considered so sacred that commoners had to prostrate themselves in his presence or risk death, forbidden even to let their shadow fall across his path. Some accounts describe these sacred children as untouchable in the most literal sense, carried everywhere so their feet would never contact common ground. Travel to ancient Persia, and you find yet another version, this time wrapped in religious law instead of royal custom alone. Zoroastrian texts describe a practice called huedoda, next of kin marriage, which some scholars interpret as including unions between siblings, parents, and children among the Persian elite and priesthood. The stated purpose wasn't political convenience, it was spiritual purity, a belief that keeping a bloodline entirely self-contained brought the family closer to a kind of cosmic wholeness. 3 unrelated civilizations, then a 4th, separated by oceans and thousands of years, arrived at almost the exact same solution to almost the exact same problem, each one certain it had discovered something sacred. That's not a coincidence. That's convergent evolution, but for an idea instead of a body part. So here's the question that should be bothering you by now. If sibling marriage kept appearing independently across cultures with no contact with each other, why does nearly every other human society on the planet treat it as one of the deepest taboos we have? Why did ordinary Egyptians, ordinary Peruvians, ordinary Hawaiians still recoil from it in their own lives, even while worshiping rulers who did it openly? And even while a handful of their own neighbors, for a strange sliver of Roman-era history, apparently didn't recoil at all. The answer comes from a Finnish sociologist named Edvard Westermarck, writing in 1891, long before anyone had the genetic tools to explain why incest produces weaker offspring. Westermarck proposed something almost embarrassingly simple. He suggested that humans who are raised together in early childhood, especially before the age of 6, develop an automatic, unconscious sexual aversion to one another later in life. Not a moral rule taught by parents or priests, a biological reflex installed by proximity itself, like a smoke detector that gets triggered by the smell of your own kitchen. For decades, this idea sat quietly, mostly ignored, dismissed by critics who insisted culture alone could explain any taboo, no biology required. Then, an anthropologist named Arthur Wolf spent years studying a strange marriage custom in rural Taiwan. Some families there practiced what were called minor marriages, where a baby girl would be adopted into her future husband's household and raised alongside him from infancy, so that when the two were old enough to marry, the wedding was already arranged and the households were already merged. Wolf tracked thousands of these marriages across decades of records, comparing them against ordinary arranged marriages, where the couple met as adults. What he found matched Westermarck almost perfectly. Couples raised together from early childhood had dramatically higher divorce rates, lower fertility, and more reported infidelity than couples who met as adults. The proximity itself had switched something off. 2 people who should have felt desire toward each other simply didn't, even though nothing forced them apart except the accident of a shared childhood. This is where the royal families start to look less like exceptions and more like a controlled experiment nobody meant to run. A pharaoh's sister wasn't raised in the same nursery he was. Royal children in Egypt, in Peru, in Hawaii were frequently separated at birth, handed to different wet nurses, raised in different wings of a palace, sometimes not meeting each other in any meaningful way until they were already approaching adulthood. The Westermarck effect needs early, continuous, intimate proximity to do its work. Remove that proximity, and the switch that normally flips in ordinary households simply never gets the signal. A prince and princess who grew up apart could look at each other as strangers, not as siblings, no matter what their blood said. Is it any wonder, then, that the very people most likely to bypass this switch were the ones whose upbringing was designed, deliberately or not, to keep them apart?
There's a psychologist named Debra Lieberman who has spent years studying exactly how this switch gets calibrated in the human mind. Her research suggests the brain doesn't actually check your genes to decide who counts as kin. It can't. Genes are invisible. Instead, the brain relies on cues it can actually observe. Cues like how long you spent living in the same household as a child, and whether you watched your mother nurse or care for that person as an infant. Those cues get compiled into an internal, unconscious estimate of relatedness, and that estimate is what actually produces the feeling of aversion, not the biology underneath it. Fool the cues, and you fool the feeling. Royal households, whether by design or by accident, fooled the cues on a civilizational scale, generation after generation, without ever knowing the name of the mechanism they were exploiting. Which means the discomfort you felt at the start of this wasn't really about blood at all. It was about a shared bath, a shared bedroom, a shared set of hands that raised you both. Take those away, and something ancient and automatic in the human mind simply doesn't know what it's supposed to protect you from anymore. What does that say about every other feeling you assume is fixed and permanent?
You don't need ancient Egypt to see this mechanism at work. An Israeli sociologist named Joseph Shepher studied something much closer to the present day, the communal kibbutzim of 20th century Israel, where unrelated children were raised together in shared children's houses from infancy, sleeping in the same rooms, bathing together, growing up almost like an artificial litter of siblings. Shepher combed through marriage records from these communities and found something remarkable. Out of nearly 3,000 marriages he examined, involving children raised together in these peer groups from before the age of 6, almost none of them married each other. Not because it was forbidden. Nothing in kibbutz law banned it. They simply weren't attracted to the people they grew up beside, even though not one drop of blood connected them. Proximity alone had done the work that biology usually gets credit for. Flip that finding around, and the royal courts of Egypt, Peru, Hawaii, and Persia look less like strange historical outliers and more like a mirror image of the kibbutz, built by accident. Where the kibbutz created intimacy between strangers and erased desire, palace life created distance between blood relatives and preserved it. Two very different arrangements, one shared mechanism, both proving the same rule from opposite directions. But knowing why the switch stayed off doesn't erase what happened when generations of it stacked up. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, though not always marrying full siblings, spent centuries marrying first cousins, uncles, and nieces to keep their empire's wealth and titles from leaving the family. By the time King Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the inbreeding had accumulated so severely that his jaw was deformed to the point of making it difficult for him to chew. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and he suffered from a long list of physical and cognitive disabilities. He was unable to have children. Geneticists who later reconstructed his family tree calculated that his level of inbreeding was mathematically close to what you'd expect from a direct parent-child union, even though his actual pedigree was cousins and uncles stacked across generations. He could barely speak until the age of 4. Courtiers described him as slow, sickly, and prematurely aged, a man in his 30s who looked and moved like someone twice that. When he died in 1700 without an heir, the dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries simply ended with him. Not from war, not from rebellion, but from its own bloodline folding in on it. So the pattern repeats everywhere you look. A family seals its power by sealing its blood. For a generation or two, the fortress holds and the throne stays untouchable, immune to rival houses and ambitious in-laws. But biology keeps a ledger, quietly, patiently, and eventually it comes due. Weakened immune systems, deformed bones, infertility, early death. The same strategy that protected a dynasty from outside rivals slowly built the rival inside its own children, one recessive gene at a time, hidden in every generation until enough of them stacked up to surface all at once. Think about what that means for the ordinary version of this instinct, the one living quietly in you right now. You've probably grown up around people you'll never feel attracted to, no matter how objectively attractive they might be to someone else. A childhood friend, a cousin who practically lived in your house, maybe even an actual sibling. That absence of attraction feels like a fact about them. It isn't. It's a fact about the years you spent in the same rooms, eating from the same table, being cared for by the same hands. Somewhere in your early childhood, a switch quietly flipped, cataloging that person as family, and it never asked your permission first.
And once you see the switch, you start noticing how much of your own life has been shaped by it without your knowledge. The friend you could never imagine dating, the neighbor's kid you grew up beside, who is now, by any objective measure, someone plenty of other people would find attractive, and yet the thought barely registers as a thought at all. You didn't decide that. A mechanism older than language decided it for you, sometime around age 4 or 5, based on nothing more than how many afternoons you spent in the same backyard. Royalty simply removed the backyard. Everything else followed from there. It's worth sitting with how strange this makes the whole idea of a taboo. We tend to imagine taboos as walls, built on purpose, enforced by law and shame and religion, standing guard over something dangerous. But this particular wall builds itself, silently, in nurseries and back gardens, whether or not any law exists to demand it. Remove the nursery, and the wall never gets built in the first place, no matter how many priests or lawmakers insist it should be there. That's what happened, over and over, inside the walls of the world's most powerful palaces.
And maybe that's the real reframe here. You started this thinking about a taboo, something that feels obvious, something that feels like it must be a rule handed down from outside you. But it isn't a rule at all. It's a mechanism built out of childhood proximity that usually works so quietly you never notice it's running. Royal families across 4 continents managed to slip past that mechanism, not by being different from you, but by removing the one ingredient the mechanism needs to switch on. And when they did, they got exactly what biology predicts when the mechanism is bypassed instead of broken. Not evil, not monsters, just a different set of childhood signals feeding a very old switch that had no idea it was looking at a king. You've probably felt a small, automatic recoil at the idea of a brother marrying a sister. Now you know it isn't really about the brother or the sister or even the blood between them. It's about the nursery you never saw, and whether anyone was ever there to make sure the switch got flipped at all.